Good morning. So I am the Director of Technology at the New York Times. I run a couple of teams. One's called Web Platforms, another one's called Multimedia. A lot of people actually know about the New York Times, but see the New York Times as a newspaper still. We're actually a digital-first company. We have hundreds of engineers, product folks, designers. It's a big digital organization. And we work very close to the newsroom to deliver, good storytelling and so on and so forth. I've been in New York for the past 7 years, but I'm actually from Brazil, from Rio de Janeiro. If you haven't been, you should. It's a beautiful city. And today we're going to talk about web performance large-scale applications. For the past couple of years, we've been redesigning the website, and we're thinking the underlying infrastructure of the website as well. And it's a pretty complex system. We have, more than 100 engineers contributing to the website. There's a lot of orchestration that needs to happen under the hood. So take into consideration performance for a site that big. There was a lot of learning along the way. So the agenda today, we're going to talk a little bit about why perceived performance matters. We're going to discuss a little bit about the difference between synthetic and real user metrics, real user monitoring. We're going to discuss the metrics that we should care about. How all of you can actually improve the performance of your website, and what's next actually for us. The work's definitely not done. There's a lot coming still. So Jacob Newson, he's a researcher. He did a research back in 1968 on response time in man-computer conversational transactions. And during that research, he was actually studying in some factories the conversation and the transaction between users and actually old interface within that factory. And he was actually taking into consideration the time and the impact of the time, how long those transactions happen, and the user behavior in that scenario. So in 1993, he looked back in that research and he kind of adapted that to web interface. And so he came up with this conclusion, like 3 main thresholds that we should actually think about. The first one is transaction that happens under 0.1 second means that the user will feel that it's instant, right? The second one is transaction that happens under 1 second. It means that you're still in the flow of thought of the user. And the third is transaction that happens under 10 seconds. It means that you can keep the user in the dialogue. And those are very important things because, if you have a website that takes, 15 seconds to load, you might, at that point, maybe the user's not there anymore, right? He just bounced. He moved on to something else. So with that in mind, and this is pretty much one of the primary reasons that we actually focus on performance for the past couple of years, it was the direct impact in user engagement and revenue. So DoubleClick, which is a company from Google, they did a research and they realized that 53% of the users, they abandon the website if it takes longer than 3 seconds. In another research, they compare websites that load under 5 seconds to website that loads under 19 seconds. And they observed that 25% higher ad availability, 70% longer average sessions, and 35% lower bounce rates. The second reason is that there is a direct impact on your ranking in social media and also, at least for news, and search in Google. It is actually not, this is not new. So Google, they released a note about this in 2010. It's been a while that Google is actually taking into consideration how quickly a website loads to actually rank you in their search, besides all the other SEO things, right? And Facebook, not too long ago, I think around 2017, they did the same. They said, well, if your websites perform really well, I'm going to actually rank you better in your social timeline. The third reason is poor internet bandwidth and low mid-range device. For us, developers and designers, we have, for the most part, we have really good devices, right? We MacBook Pros and iPhones and like high-end Androids. We work as we develop those products. We actually have a pretty good internet and all that kind of stuff. So there's a lot in many countries, and Brazil being one of them. The internet is expensive and it's also not good. So there was a research from one company called Caliber, which they do synthetic testing. We're going to talk a little bit about it in a little bit. But they try to match, because data is also expensive, right? Especially in developing countries like Brazil. So they did a research that they were like trying to match, like how much data costs, right? Based on how much money you can make, like the minimum wage of those countries. So the conclusion was like absurd. Like in Brazil, for example, you need to work 13 hours to be able to pay for 500 megabytes, where in Germany you only need to work 1 hour. So there's a lot of this thinking about performance comes with having empathy as well, right? To make sure that as you develop new products, that you take into consideration people that they have a low, mid-range device, or their internet just sucks, you know. So, well, this question comes comes to us pretty often. Like the first thing that we want to know is like, how do I actually know if my website's fast or not, right? How do I measure that? And then there are two main ways that you can actually see how your website's performing. Two techniques, I'd say. One is what we call synthetic monitoring, and the other one is real user monitoring. The synthetic monitoring is kind of a black box approach. You have a controlled environment where you can simulate network, you can simulate geolocation, and then you just, you record the experience, you pull that data back, and that's it, right? The real user metrics, it's more about you have a JavaScript snippet file that you deliver with the website to every user out there, and then that data comes back from the real user browsers back to you and to like Google Analytics or to any tracking system that you might have. And there are some pros and cons with both approach. For the synthetic monitoring, the good thing about it is that it's out of the box. So most of the solutions for synthetic tests is just, you just go there and use it. So it requires very little work. Some of them is web page tests, which is a tool from Google that have been around since 2012. But there's a Caliber, a Speedy Curve, Lighthouse from Google, which is like more recent. So there's a bunch of different solutions there. Another benefit from synthetic testing is that you can do video recording and can generate film strip. So basically, as you're loading the website within these control environments, you can generate like a video and it can look into it and understand, how the application is actually loading. The third is that you have a detailed like waterfall chart, basically to understand how your resources are being loaded, like the order of every asset and so on and so forth. And some of the cons with this approach is you have a limited sample size, right? Because you're simulating the geolocation, the network, so it does not necessarily reflect where your user is coming from. So that's one problem. And the other one is network throttling. So simulating mobile network is really challenging. I mean, you have probably noticed this, but sometimes you're in the phone and have like signals all the way up there. You have LTE, but the browser, it just doesn't load. It takes forever. Because in mobile network, you need to consider that you might be walking in a shade area between antennas, and so which is like you get into that spotty mode, and that's really, really hard to simulate in a control environment. The other way to do it's real user monitoring, which the good things about it is that you have a larger sample size. So basically, remember, like the data is coming from the real user browsers, right? So whether they're in Brazil, in New York, in Latvia, it doesn't matter. Like all that data is going to come in whatever network situation is going on, in whatever geolocation they are. So they're like really good things. And the third is like because the data is coming from the real user browsers, you can correlate that data with your KPIs, right? You can say, this user, he spent, 10 minutes in his session, in my website, and he didn't bounce, and this is how his connectivity looked like, and then it can take someone, another user with a different scenario and so on and so forth, and can take decisions based on that. Some of the cons is you have limited performance metrics, which I'm going to talk a little bit about in a minute. It does require coding, so remember, it's like those are JavaScript snippets that you need to report back to you, right, with all that data. So basically, it requires some coding. And you have limited waterfall analysis. So because, you don't know those users. You're just seeing the bits and bits of data that's coming back from them. I mean, in reality, you actually need both, but for different reasons. I think for the first one, for the synthetic approach, the good thing about it is like you can do diagnostics, right? You can actually, it's easier for you to dig in and to understand how your application is performing, or if there's something wrong. The second one is product development. So you can use synthetic testing as you're creating new features or developing new products. You can understand how the performance looks like. And you can do competitive benchmarking as well. So because it's a control environment, you can basically run, the Diana website. Diana, am I pronouncing correctly? Almost, Diana. You can run the Diana website like right in parallel to the New York Times in the same control environment, and you can have a one-to-one comparison there. And for the real user monitoring, as I said, you can actually have a comparison with how the application performs and the conversion rates. And I would take the real user metrics actually as a source of truth in a way that understanding it really represents the user behavior, because you can use percentile, median, consider the users all over the globe. So with that said, we're going to talk a little bit about what metrics we should actually care about, and there are a lot out there. One of metrics that you're probably familiar with, which is DOM content loaded and page load. It's vastly supported by by all the browsers out there, so you're probably familiar with those. But they not necessarily represent the user flow, right? Remember, like when I was talking earlier on about Jacob Nielsen and understanding, giving the feedback to the user because of that transaction, the conversation. So it's really important for us to understand how quickly we painted something to the user, and how quickly we painted something to the user that was meaningful, and so on. And I mean, if you see this, like it doesn't tell us that, right? With DOM content loaded and page load. So we need more. We need other metrics. So thankfully, this is not supported by all browsers yet. It's only supported by Chrome for now. But now we have some other metrics that it can be reported by the users, by the user browsers, right? If they do have Chrome. One of them is called first paint, which is the first time that you paint something on the screen. The other one is first contentful paint, which there's a broader like layout modification within the above default of your application. And then the first interactive, which is, it means that the application is ready for you to interact at that point. So those are available now in for only in Chrome as an API. So there are like JavaScript APIs and polyfills for you there. And there are some other metrics that they are on the synthetic side, and they are render start, first meaningful paint, and speed index. All those metrics within synthetic, they are based on the video recording that I talked about, right? As in literally like with web page test, for example, you record a video, and web page test does an analysis within the video to understand where a pixel changed in one of the frames of the video, and they take that into like render start, for example. So those are kind of like the metrics that we have available. I'd say the primary ones in synthetic and RUM. And then there's one more thing. The first meaningful paint, which they're available only in synthetic, it's a really important metric, because not only you want to know when you render something to the user, but you want to know if that was meaningful or not, right? And meaningful does, like something that is meaningful for your website might not be meaningful for my website, and so it's really tricky. There's a spec now in progress. Some folks from Google, they're working on it. It might become a draft, and they might have available as like through an API in Chrome. So far, we have none. But you can actually use the API called user timing. There's a typo there. There's an API available called user timing, which you can, for now, through coding and through some JavaScript, actually understand what's really meaningful for you, if it was painted or not. So a couple of things about like speed index and first interactive. Speed index is a really interesting metric, because it not only tells you how long it took to load the above default content, but it's also tell you how quickly it load. And so this is, if you take the blue and the red box, they both took the same time, exactly the same time to actually load. The difference between the two of them is that the first one, you load the majority of the content very early on. So it means that's better, right? The lower the number, the better there. And the other one is First Interactive. This is actually, I was in Brazil, and I was using the website, and I noticed like how long it was taking for the application to be ready for me. You can see that in the left top corner, I'm trying to open the nav, and it's just not happening, right? It's just not working. It means that the application's not actually ready for me to interact with, and it can be extremely frustrating. This is actually really common now in this isomorphic single-page application approach that many of you are probably looking into it right now or already developed on top of it, because we send all the data, if it's an isomorphic app, all the data we render to the user, and then there's a lot that needs to happen within React to actually add on top of it all the behavior and so on and so forth. And that time can actually lead to this, right? So I did a comparison to kind of show, this video was actually recorded with Web Page Test. So you can go to Web Page Test and try your own website, comparing the New York Times with Washington Post. I did this a few days ago. But you can kind of see what I'm talking about. You can see that it's taking a while for the New York Times to load. You just see a gray box. You don't know what it is, right? Nothing yet. And then like Washington Post already rendered. You can see there is a player, there is a placeholder over there. And it's like, and this is one of the, this is because one thing that we changed on the website recently. I'd say probably a couple years ago, we enable autoplay in article and caused this. So the reason that it is taking a long time for us to actually fix, I mean, not to fix, it's taking a long time for us to actually show that it's a play is because we are trying to autoplay and Washington Post was not. And so it's something that we are looking into right now to give like a better feedback to this, right? In this case, for example, we can see autoplay, but at this moment, you can have the placeholder there and just let the user know, like, this is a player. This is what the video is about, and we're going to play when we're ready, right? But we are not doing a good job there. So how do I improve the performance of my website? I mean, before I talk about that, I'd say it's good to think about these 4 statements for a little bit. One is like, our main concern used to be network, and I think now we should care about CPU. And the main reasons is tied to the amount of JavaScript how heavy in JavaScript our applications have become. And it's very common, the main thread of the browser is extremely busy for a really long time. So take into consideration that we need to care about CPU now, especially with low and mid-range device, important thing. React and JavaScript ecosystems extremely fragmented. I think the third is your computing internet is actually way faster than probably the majority of the people in the globe, so we need to remember that. And the fourth is single-page application is pretty cool, but it made some things harder performance-wise, especially talking about CPU and so on. So with that said, there's a website called HTTP Archive, and you can actually analyze the internet as a whole. And I picked like the last 8 years, and the numbers with JavaScript is like it's incredible. So for the past 8 years, the amount of JavaScript rendered like throughout websites all over the globe have grown 570%, which is insane. And I mean, the internet speed or the mobile device, they haven't actually improved in a rate of 500%, right? And that's why it's so important for us to care about this. So this is actually like, I have like 5 suggestions for you to kind of improve the performance of a website. Considering which in our case, we have a isomorphic single page application. running Node and React, and that's kind of the scenario a little bit that we have. So the suggestions will be somewhat tied to that, and some others you can be broadly use whatever stack you have. And the 5 there is also because, I'm not sure if you know this, but we have won more World Cups than anyone else. So the other World Cup is around the corner. Debatable. So yeah. So the first one is CDN, which, you know, it probably doesn't come as a surprise. Most of you are probably using CDN already. But I'd say it has become more important than ever for some reasons. CDN bring like your application close to all the users out there. So even if you have a pretty sophisticated infrastructure, like we did at the times, we now, for the past couple of years, we have retired a lot of our data centers and stuff, and we have relied 100% on the cloud and on CDN. And if you're doing server-side rendering with React, which we are, it's really expensive. Node is single-threaded. There is a lot of sync operations that need to happen within React to render the tree, and that can block the event loop. Anyhow, so if you take that aspect into performance, like most likely doing server-side rendering with React, your application will perform worse than whatever you're using before. But because we rely so heavily on CDN, that it's been okay for us. It's been fine. The other benefit of using CDN is that it offers HTTP2, which is really important because you can do multiplexing. You can actually serve, have direct channels and serve more files in parallel than otherwise. Most of CDNs today, they offer image service, which means that you can actually request the image that you need in the exactly size for a given device, right? Like for your mobile device or for your desktop, instead of rendering really large images in a mobile device, for example. And you can also, like with an image service, you can dynamically use like new image formats, like WebP, for example. The other benefit is, depending on which service you want to use, like we use Fastly at the times, and it can do pretty sophisticated things since it under the hood runs Varnish, so you can actually use VCLs to do all sort of crazy stuff. So the second thing, which is also not news, is optimize the critical rendering path with one twist in this, which is prioritize your above-the-fold rendering. And so this is extremely important because you want to give feedback to the user as quickly as possible, right? As we were talking about before. So the first one is for the critical CSS, like our previous talk, we were talking about, like one of the examples was how much CSS was actually being pushed to the user but not being used. So there are some techniques for you to render inline only the CSS that you need on the top of the page. And you can look into a library called load CSS and grunt critical, or you can go full on CSS in JS, and we've been using emotion at the times, which basically you just render the CSS that is also like needed as well. It's important to lazy load the image, so not only use the image service to make sure that the size of the image makes sense, but also lazy load them. So do not load any image that's not above the fold at first. And there are, like, different strategies there too. And for web fonts are extremely expensive. So make sure that you have like the exact subset of web fonts that you need to render the above the fold content, and you actually defer the rest. So I talked a little bit about how much JavaScript our application have nowadays. So it's important for you to watch out for the bundle size of it. You can create budgets for it. You can remove unnecessary dependencies. There is a plugin for Webpack called Webpack Bundle Analyzer, which you can go through all the dependencies that you have and remove the ones that are not necessary for you. Implement code splitting. So in a word of single-page application, it will, if you don't do anything, you will most likely be shipping a lot of JavaScript that not necessarily that experience you need. So you can do route splitting. You can do this with Webpack as well, and you can do component-based code splitting as well. And you can use service workers to pre-cache all the bundles in advance. The fourth one is service workers and resource prioritization. when possible, pre-cache assets using service worker. And there is one feature called resource prioritization, which it's supported by most of the browsers, Chrome, Firefox. I think the only one is that does not support it, IE 11. Surprise, surprise. And it's actually really interesting because the browser will actually give the priority to the assets without you doing anything, right? The browser will actually try to understand, like, okay, this image deserves better, like, higher priority in how I'm going to start to request it, right, through network and so on and so forth. But you can actually manage that too. So if you tell the browser, say, this JavaScript bundle is really important for me to render the above default content, you can just use like a couple of link tags and say preload them, and the browser will actually change the priority and will prioritize that library early on. And the last one, which is probably the most difficult of all, which is around development process and culture. One thing that we noticed was when we started the replatform process was you can come up with something that's really fast, but if you work in a really large organization with many engineers working on application, like it can derail fairly quickly, right, or fairly easy. So you need to actually make sure that the culture change and there is a straightforward development process to keep it there, right, to make sure that the performance of application continue to improve. So one of the ways that we did this at the times was to create ways, to facilitate ways for developers to test their new features or GitHub branches in a way using synthetic tests, like in a synthetic environment. So they can literally, like, if they're coming up with something new, they can go there, they can test, they can compare with production, and they can see if it makes sense or not. I think it makes sense for you to look for partners in the organization, like other developers, that actually can carry out the word about performance and why that's important and why that matters. And one thing that, it has happened with me before a few times, which, I mean, I want to do all this, but my boss doesn't want to do that, right? I mean, I care about performance, but the company doesn't yet. And I think the idea there is for you to try to use real user metrics. And you can do that with like very little effort and try to correlate that with user engagement. And I think having access to that data and showing that data to senior leadership and to your boss, it might help him to understand why this is so important. Yeah, with that said, that was, I think, oh, we still have what next? That's right. So for web fonts, we're actually not using service workers yet. We are using local storage as our web font strategy. So basically, the user comes for the first time, it's going to take a little longer for the web font to load, and then we store that in local storage. I've been doing this for a really long time. I think we can do better there. We can now use service workers. We took a little longer because only recently Safari started supporting service workers, so now you can actually, in iOS, it was pretty important for us, so that's why it took so long. And for Apollo Client, Apollo Client is a library, it's a client for GraphQL, and there are ways for you to actually prefetch content in your GraphQL server, and can kind of, try to say, like, for example, if the user is in the home page of the New York Times, he'll most likely click to go to a story, right? What we can do in advance, I can prefetch all the data that's needed to render those articles above the fold, for example, right? And so the experience from that moment on will be way faster. So something that we're going to start experimenting with. And the third is we've been doing code splitting based on routes, just using Webpack. But there is an opportunity there for us to use component-based as well, in the component level, using a library called React Loadable. So for the past I took this charge like for the past 6 months. This is kind of, by doing all that throughout the past 6 months, you can see the drop of CSS usage, image, and JavaScript. And the result was, a faster website. I think the techniques and the technologies is out there, but I guess the challenge is, as I was saying, how can you bring those to our development process, change our culture, and make sure that we have the right setup to continue to improve the performance of websites. That was it. Thank you very much.
Don't go missing. We have time and we have a couple of questions. So Germans is asking, real user monitoring and data privacy, are there any hidden underwater rocks?
Are they what? I'm sorry?
Underwater rocks. So any underwater rocks?
Underwater rocks with
Like
real user monitoring?
Yeah.
Yeah, there are. I think because the new metrics that it's available just in Chrome right now, they're great. The first paint and the first interactive, but the challenge is that it's only in Chrome. So it's still like, I was talking about page loaded and component loaded. Like for the real user monitoring, we still use them because they are supported across all the browsers, right? So I guess that's, I'd say, the most challenging thing right now for.
But are there any privacy issues that could arise or no?
Oh, around privacy. I don't think so. Like we went through the whole GDPR thing now, and it was fine. We did take that in each consideration, and it was okay, because with GDPR you cannot correlate that data with the end user. I mean, if it's just saying, first paint took a second, but there is no IP address or email or nothing tied with that information, you will fine.
And the second question is, how do you balance web performance with opposing business requirements, e.g. countless ad networks, analytics, tracking scripts that are often larger than the site content itself? It was asked by Kristaps.
It's a really good question. I should probably update these slides and put it there. It was really hard, and for the tracking part of it, we were able to reduce the number of trackers by, I'd say, maybe 25-30%, and it required a lot of work, literally manual work. We worked with the data analytics team at the New York Times to kind of understand who owned those trackers, and see if they were needed still. So there was a little cleanup in that sense. It was really heavy in process, so it was hard. We do have budgets now. Remember, they was talking about budgets that you should have for your assets. We have created budgets for third-party scripts as well, and those are really important because you can monitor them. If they go up like crazy, you know that something is actually weird, something is wrong. So that was third-party. And for advertising, it's been pretty challenging as well, but we worked. Actually, when we kick off this project, we created like a small team just focused on advertising, that they worked with us very closely while we were creating the new product to make sure that we were still able to serve all the ad creatives that we care about without disrupting the performance of the website. And we actually did that. It was pretty much by deferring everything that was related to advertising. And now we're actually going back and work with them again to make sure that we can improve ad viewability within this new setup that we have. It's challenging, but it's a lot about understanding the ownership of those trackers and make sure that there's budget set and